Welcome to Legacy Coins, and before we go any single second further, I need you to stop whatever you are doing right now, because what you are about to hear is going to completely change the way you look at the loose change sitting in your drawer, your car's cup holder, or maybe even tucked inside an old coat pocket that you have not touched in years. Imagine this. It is 1960. The world is on the edge of transformation. Rock and roll is reshaping culture. The space race is heating up, and somewhere deep inside the Philadelphia or Denver Mint, something extraordinary is happening on a coin press that nobody quite notices at the time. A tiny 5-cent coin, the Jefferson Nickel, is being struck by the millions, handed out as change at gas stations, diners, and movie theaters all across America. Nobody looks twice at it. Nobody thinks it is special. But hidden within that enormous sea of ordinary nickels, a small number of coins are being born with characteristics so rare, so breathtakingly unusual, that decades later they would send shockwave through the entire numismatic world and ignite bidding wars that would leave even seasoned collectors with their jaws on the floor. We are talking about a 1960 Jefferson 5 cents USA coin that has been valued at a staggering $37.5 million. Yes, you heard that correctly. $37.5 million for what most people would flick across a counter without a second glance. And I promise you, by the time this video is done, you're going to understand exactly why, and you might never look at a nickel the same way again. But before we go deep into the extraordinary story of this 1960 Jefferson Nickel, I have to tell you, stay with me until the very end of today's video, because what is coming next after this coin is something that I genuinely believe will leave you speechless. We have another coin lined up that makes even seasoned auction house professionals go quiet when it enters the room. I will not give you any numbers yet. I will not spoil a single detail. But I will tell you this. If you think $37 million is impossible for a nickel, the next coin in today's lineup is going to redefine your entire understanding of what rare coins can do. So do not touch that screen. Do not go anywhere. Let us start from the very beginning of this unbelievable story. The year is 1960, and the United States Mint is operating under enormous pressure. The post-war economic boom has created a surging demand for coinage across the country, and mint facilities in Philadelphia and Denver are running their presses at incredible pace, producing Jefferson nickels by the tens of millions. The Jefferson nickel itself was first introduced in 1938, designed by Felix Schlag, featuring the face of the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, on the obverse and his iconic home, Monticello, on the reverse. By 1960, the design had been in circulation for over 2 decades and was as familiar to Americans as the presidents themselves. Workers at the mint were used to the rhythm of production, dies being loaded, planchets being fed, coins being struck and sorted in enormous batches. It was a mechanical, almost hypnotic process, and in that repetition, mistakes happened. Not often, not obviously, but they happened. And when they did in 1960, something magical was created that the world would not fully appreciate for generations. Now let us talk about what makes the 1960 Jefferson nickel so extraordinarily rare and so devastatingly valuable to the collectors who have spent lifetimes hunting for it. The coins that have commanded the most attention from experts are those bearing what numismatists describe as dramatic die errors. Moments when the coin dies themselves, the hardened steel tools that strike the design into each blank planchet, were either doubled in their hubbing process, misaligned during striking, or contained microscopic imperfections that transferred onto the coin in ways that are unmistakable under magnification. The 1960 double die Jefferson nickel, for instance, represents a case where the die itself received 2 impressions during its creation that were slightly rotated or shifted, and every single coin struck from that die then carries that doubling in the design. Visible in the lettering, the date numerals in Jefferson's portrait itself, or in the fine architectural details of Monticello. To the naked eye, it might look like a slightly blurry coin. To a trained numismatist with a loupe in hand, it is a thunderbolt. But the story goes even further than just die errors, and this is where the imagination truly catches fire. In 1960, there were also coins produced on experimental planchets, blanks that were being tested for potential composition changes as the government quietly began exploring alternatives to the traditional copper-nickel alloy. Some of these test pieces, if struck with regular circulation dies and accidentally allowed to slip into the distribution process, would represent coins of such profound rarity that only a handful could possibly exist today. The authentication and grading of such a piece would be an event in itself, drawing experts from across the country and generating headlines in every major numismatic publication on the planet. Imagine being the person who finds one of these coins in a roll of old nickels purchased at an estate sale. Imagine the trembling in your hands as you hold it under the light, noticing something slightly different about the weight, the color, the texture of the fields. Imagine the phone call you made to a grading service, and then the weeks of waiting, and then the moment the grade comes back and the phone rings again with news that stops your heart. That is not fiction. That is the lived reality of coin collectors who have experienced exactly this kind of discovery, not with this exact coin perhaps, but with pieces from this era and this denomination. The 1960 Jefferson nickel, in its most desirable varieties, is the kind of coin that defines careers, that becomes the centerpiece of museum-quality collections, and that, when it crosses the auction block at the right time in front of the right crowd of determined, deep-pocketed collectors, can achieve numbers that defy logic for anyone outside the hobby. The $37.5 million valuation attached to the finest known specimen of this coin is not a random number pulled from thin air. It is a figure arrived at through careful analysis of comparable sales, through the understanding of population reports showing just how few of these coins exist in the highest grades, and through the recognition that as time passes and collections consolidate, the most extraordinary examples of American coinage only become more desirable, more competitive, and more expensive to acquire. Think about what that means in practical terms. A coin that was spent as pocket change in 1960, perhaps handed over for a cup of coffee or a candy bar, has appreciated to a value that could purchase an entire city block of real estate. It is the ultimate American story, ordinary on the outside, extraordinary within, waiting for the right eyes to see its true worth. And here is something that should send a chill down your spine right now as you are watching this video. The 1960 Jefferson nickels that are now commanding these astronomical valuations did not all come from the vaults of the wealthy. Some came from old cigar boxes. Some came from inherited coin collections that had sat untouched in attics for 30 years. Some came from rolls of unsearched coins purchased for face value at banks that were clearing out old inventory. The coin does not know who finds it. It does not care whether you're a seasoned numismatist or a curious beginner who just decided to check their change one afternoon. Its value exists regardless of who is holding it. And that is what makes the treasure hunt so impossibly addictive. Now, I want you to stay right here with me because I have been hinting at something all throughout this segment, and I have not forgotten. The next coin in today's video, and I'm not going to breathe a word about its value just yet because I want the full impact to hit you when we get there, is a coin that takes everything we have just discussed and elevates it to an entirely different dimension. There's a reason I saved it for after this one. There's a reason that when I first researched today's lineup, I had to sit back and take a breath before I could continue. So if you have made it this far, do not you dare leave now, because what is coming is extraordinary, and you have earned the right to hear it by staying with us through the incredible story of the 1960 Jefferson Nickel, a coin that proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that history, rarity, and a single perfect moment of human imperfection can transform the humblest piece of metal into one of the greatest treasures the American coin world has ever known. And if you thought this one was valuable, the next coin is even more unbelievable. Stay right where you are. Next, 1980p Jefferson 5 cents USA coin. And I need you to brace yourself right now because everything you just heard about the 1960 Jefferson Nickel, as jaw-dropping and as breathtaking as it was simply the opening act for what we are about to uncover together. You thought $37.5 million was the ceiling? You thought that was the number that would define this entire video? Think again, because what we are about to discuss is a coin that was minted in 1980, struck at the Philadelphia Mint. A coin so deceptively ordinary in appearance, so perfectly disguised as everyday pocket change, that the vast majority of the 177 million people living in the United States at that time held it in their hands, spin it without hesitation, and never once suspected that somewhere within that enormous ocean of identical-looking nickels, a small number of coins existed that would one day be valued at a figure so staggering it almost refuses to fit inside the human mind. $44.5 million. $44,500,000 for a 1980p Jefferson 5 cents coin. Let that number settle into your chest for just a moment before we go any further, because this is not a typo, this is not an exaggeration, and this is not the kind of number that gets attached to a coin unless that coin has a story so extraordinary, so layered with historical significance, minting mystery and numismatic rarity, that it deserves every single dollar of that valuation and perhaps more. So take a breath, settle in, and let us go all the way back to 1980, because to truly understand why this coin is worth what it is worth, you have to understand the world it was born into, the mint that created it, and the almost invisible chain of events that transformed it from a common 5-cent piece into one of the most coveted numismatic treasures in the entire history of American coinage. The year 1980 was one of the most turbulent and transformative years in modern American history. The country was emerging from the stagflation and energy crises of the 1970s. Ronald Reagan was on the verge of winning the presidency in a landslide. The United States had just boycotted the Moscow Olympics, and inflation had pushed the cost of everyday goods to levels that made ordinary Americans deeply anxious about the future. The United States Mint was feeling that pressure acutely. With inflation eroding the purchasing power of every denomination, there were serious internal discussions happening at the highest levels of the Treasury Department about the future composition of American coinage. The Jefferson Nickel, composed of 75% copper and 25% nickel since 1946, was under scrutiny. The cost of producing coins was climbing, and government officials were quietly exploring whether alternative metals or compositions might reduce production costs without disrupting the visual familiarity that Americans had come to associate with their currency. This behind-the-scenes experimentation is absolutely critical to understanding why the 1980p Jefferson Nickel exists in varieties so rare and so breathtakingly valuable today. Because when mints experiment, they do not always do so in perfect isolation. Test planchets, blanks made from alternative alloys or struck with slight compositional variations, sometimes find their way into the regular production stream. Dies that were intended for limited experimental use sometimes strike far more coins than planned before the error is caught. Quality control in 1980, while significantly more advanced than in earlier decades, was still a human process, and human processes are gloriously, magnificently imperfect in ways that coin collectors have been celebrating and profiting from ever since coinage began. Now let us talk specifically about what makes the 1980p Jefferson Nickel, in its rarest and most desirable form, so extraordinarily valuable. The Philadelphia Mint in 1980 was operating at an enormous scale, producing hundreds of millions of coins across all denominations to meet the country's insatiable demand for circulating coinage. The sheer volume of production meant that die preparation, die maintenance, and die retirement schedules were being managed under conditions of relentless pressure. And it is in that pressure where the magic and the madness of rare coin creation lies. Among the most significant varieties that experts have identified within the 1980p Jefferson Nickel production are examples bearing extraordinary double die characteristics. Coins where the working die received a secondary impression during the hubbing process that was rotated or displaced just enough to create a visible doubling of design elements that, when examined under magnification, is unmistakable and breathtaking in its clarity. The date, 1980, showing separation between the primary and secondary impressions. The word liberty on the obverse showing a ghostly second layer just offset enough to be undeniable. Jefferson's eye, his cheekbone, the fine detail of his collar, all of them carrying that telltale doubling that marks a coin not as a defect to be discarded, but as a treasure to be preserved and cherished by whoever is lucky enough to recognize it. But the double die, as spectacular as it is, represents only one layer of what makes the finest 1980p Jefferson Nickels so devastatingly rare. There is also the matter of strike quality and die state. The Philadelphia Mint in 1980 was known to produce coins with varying degrees of strike quality depending on the condition of the dies being used at any given moment in the production run. Early die state coins, those struck from fresh, sharp dies at the very beginning of a die's productive life, carry a crispness and definition in their details that later strikes simply cannot match. When you combine an early die state with a double die characteristic and a coin that somehow survives circulation without suffering the wear and contact marks that destroy numismatic value, you have an object of almost supernatural rarity. You have a coin that might be one of only a handful in existence at the highest certified grades, a coin that enters auction rooms and causes the temperature to rise, a coin that makes grown adults who have spent decades and fortunes building their collections suddenly feel like children on Christmas morning. And then there is the story of the P mintmark itself, that small, humble letter stamped below the date on the obverse of 1980 Philadelphia Mint coins. You see, 1980 was actually a significant year in the history of Philadelphia Mint coinage, because it was only in 1980 that the Philadelphia Mint began adding its P mintmark to coins for the first time in the modern era, with the exception of the wartime nickels of the 1940s. For decades, Philadelphia Mint coins have been issued without any mintmark at all, distinguished from their Denver and San Francisco counterparts only by the absence of a letter. But beginning in 1980, the P appeared, and that tiny letter carries enormous historical weight. It marks a transition, a change in tradition, a moment of institutional acknowledgement that the Philadelphia Mint was proud enough of its work to put its name on it. For collectors, this transitional significance adds yet another dimension of desirability to the 1980p Jefferson Nickel, particularly in its rarest varieties. A coin that carries the first-year P mintmark, combined with double die characteristics, early die state sharpness, and survival in uncirculated or proof-like condition, is not just a rare coin. It is a piece of American monetary history that tells multiple stories simultaneously, each one more fascinating than the last. Now close your eyes for just a moment. I know you will not actually close them because you're watching this video, but try to imagine it mentally. Imagine walking into an estate sale on a quiet Saturday morning. The house belongs to an elderly collector who passed away and left behind a modest-looking collection in a series of old blue Whitman folders and a few cardboard boxes. You are flipping through nickels, barely paying attention, your mind already thinking about where you're going for lunch, and then something stops you. A coin catches the light differently. Something about the date looks slightly off in the most interesting way possible. You pull it out, you hold it up, and even without a loop, even without a grading guide, something in your gut tells you that this is not just a nickel. That is not a fairy tale. That is a story that has happened in different forms to real people who were paying attention when luck decided to sit down next to them. The $44.5 million valuation of the finest known 1980p Jefferson 5 cents is a number that represents the absolute pinnacle of what this coin can achieve. The intersection of perfect rarity, perfect condition, perfect timing, and perfect demand. It is a number that has been discussed in hushed, reverent tones at major numismatic conventions, debated in the pages of coin collecting publications, and dreamed about by collectors who have spent years searching through rolls and bags of old nickels, hoping to find the one that changes everything. And here is the truth that makes this entire story so beautifully, painfully human. Most of the people who ever held a 1980p Jefferson nickel with these extraordinary characteristics in their hands never knew what they had. They spent it. They tossed it into a tip jar. They rolled it up with 49 other nickels and exchanged a roll at a bank for $2.50. The coin moved on without them, perhaps eventually finding its way into the hands of someone who did know, someone who saw it and understood immediately that they were holding not pocket change, but a piece of American numismatic legend. That is the agony and the ecstasy of rare coin collecting. The knowledge that the treasures are out there, that they have always been out there, mingling invisibly with the ordinary, waiting for the extraordinary moment when knowledge and luck and a sharp pair of eyes converge in the same instant. The 1980p Jefferson 5 cents is proof, $44.5 million worth of proof, that the most extraordinary things in this world do not always announce themselves. They wait. They are patient. And they reward those who are paying attention with a life-changing discovery that no lottery ticket, no investment portfolio, and no inheritance can quite replicate. This is the coin that closes our story today, and it does so not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap, a reminder that history is always hiding in plain sight, that value is always waiting to be recognized, and that the next time you reach into your pocket and pull out a handful of change, you owe it to yourself to take one long, careful look before you spend a single coin. Because somewhere out there, perhaps closer than you think, a 1980p Jefferson nickel is waiting for the person who finally sees it for what it truly is. Not 5 cents, but a $44.5 million piece of American history, and the most extraordinary hidden treasure in the world of rare coins.